My father laughed at the invitation before he even finished reading it. The message appeared in our family group chat while I was standing by the window of my apartment, looking out over the Chicago skyline glowing against the evening sky. An award ceremony, he typed. A second message followed almost immediately. You're still working as a clerk. Right. 3 dots appeared again. These office things are usually just participation certificates. A laughing emoji blinked at the end of the sentence. Before I could respond, my brother Daniel joined the chat. Tonight's actually bad timing. He wrote, I'm introducing my girlfriend to the family. My father replied within seconds. Well, then that settles it. Another message appeared. Dinner with your brother is more important. The phone screen dimmed slightly in my hand while the lights of the city shimmered across the glass in front of me. My name is Isabella Mercer. I'm 36 years old. Before I continue, a small clarification. The story you're about to hear is written for the Revenge Pulse channel to explore family dynamics, consequences, and personal growth. Names and identifying details have been changed, and the events are presented for educational and storytelling purposes, rather than to represent any specific real-world individuals. And the ceremony they were dismissing so casually wasn't some small office gathering. Tonight my firm was presenting the Global Real Estate Strategy Award, the biggest recognition of my career. But in my family, Daniel had always been the one whose milestones mattered. Another message appeared. You can send us a photo of your little trophy later, Daniel wrote. I let out a quiet breath and placed the phone beside the formal invitation resting on my kitchen counter. 3 seats had been reserved next to my name at the gala. 3 seats I had hoped my family might finally fill. They wouldn't. And the truth is, moments like that dinner weren't unusual. For years, my role in the Mercer family had been simple. Daniel was the future. My father was the legacy. And I was the reliable one. The one who handled problems quietly. The one who made sure things kept working. What my father and brother didn't know that night was that the life they were choosing over me, the house they were probably laughing in right now, had been standing for years because someone quietly kept the numbers balanced. And if they thought my award ceremony didn't matter, what would happen when the person quietly holding their world together finally decided to stop? The house my father loved to show off stood on the quiet edge of North Shore, Chicago, where the lakefront properties looked less like homes and more like monuments. $5 million of glass, stone, and perfectly trimmed hedges overlooking Lake Michigan. Victor Mercer liked to call it proof of his instincts. Whenever guests visited, he would guide them through the wide marble foyer with the pride of a man presenting a trophy. My real estate instincts built this house, he often declared, tapping the oak banister as if he had carved it himself. His friends usually nodded in admiration. Daniel certainly did. My brother loved that house. To him, it represented everything our family supposedly stood for: success, status, permanence. You don't get places like this unless you know what you're doing. Daniel once told a group of friends during a barbecue on the terrace. He believed every word. What none of them liked to remember was what had happened 3 years earlier. Victor Mercer's development company had collapsed under a mountain of bad loans and over-leveraged projects. The market turned. Investors disappeared. And one afternoon, the bank called. 2 weeks later, the word foreclosure appeared in a letter thick enough to feel like a verdict. I remember sitting across from the loan officer in a quiet downtown office while he flipped through the documents. Your father's company can't support the mortgage anymore, he said carefully. Without a guarantor, the bank will begin foreclosure proceedings. He paused, looking at me over his glasses. You understand, this means someone else would be responsible for the payments. I nodded. The monthly obligation was just over $32,000, a number large enough to change most people's lives. I signed the paperwork anyway. From that moment forward, the North Shore house stopped being protected by my father's reputation. It was protected by something far simpler: math. Every month after that, the mortgage stayed current. The house stayed quiet. The bank stayed patient. My father knew a private investor had stepped in to stabilize the property. He mentioned it occasionally at dinner. "Someone out there understands the value of this place," he would say proudly. But he had never once asked the question that actually mattered. Who? Standing in my apartment that night, looking at the invitation my father had just laughed at, a quiet realization settled into place. The house he called his legacy had been surviving for years because someone else had been quietly keeping it alive. The steakhouse Daniel chose that night sat on the corner of Oak and Stevenson, the kind of place where the lighting is soft, the wine list is long, and people go to be seen. Stevenson's Steakhouse was already buzzing when my family arrived. Daniel walked in first, smiling like a man presenting a new success story. Behind him was Lila Grant, tall, perfectly styled, phone already in her hand. "Okay, guys, we just got here," she said to the small ring light clipped to her phone. Dinner with Daniel's family tonight. Her livestream counter climbed quickly. Hundreds of viewers. Then thousands. Victor Mercer seemed to enjoy the attention immediately. He straightened his jacket as the host led them toward a large corner table. Lila turned the phone toward him. "So this is Daniel's dad," she said cheerfully to the stream. Victor raised his glass slightly. "Pleasure," he said, clearly enjoying the performance. A few minutes later, after drinks arrived and the menus were closed, Lila tilted the phone again. "So wait," she asked casually. "Daniel mentioned he has a sister." She glanced at him. "Where is she tonight?" Daniel laughed as he cut into his steak. "Some office award thing." Victor waved a dismissive hand. "Clerks need their little trophies," he said lightly. The table laughed. The live stream chat filled with comments. "Sounds like the boring sibling. Someone has to do the paperwork." Lila smiled at the screen. "So she works in the office side of things?" Victor shook his head. "Something like that." He took a sip of wine. "But she's always been the responsible one." 20 miles away, the ballroom of the Grand Regency Hotel glowed with chandeliers and quiet conversations. I stood near the entrance of the gala hall, holding the event program in my hands. 3 seats had been reserved beside my name. 3 empty chairs. Across the room, applause erupted as someone else finished their speech. I glanced down at my phone one last time. Lila's live stream was still running, my father laughing, my brother smiling, my name turning into a punchline for strangers I had never met. For a moment, I watched. Then I locked the screen. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the stage. Behind me, the 3 empty chairs remained exactly where they were, waiting for people who had already chosen not to come. The Grand Regency Ballroom looked nothing like the steakhouse where my family was celebrating without me. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted in gold leaf. Waiters moved quietly between tables filled with investors, developers, and executives who managed more money in a quarter than most companies saw in a decade. In this room, titles mattered. Results mattered even more. I took my seat near the front of the ballroom, the event program resting beside my glass of water. 3 empty chairs remained next to my name. No one commented. No one asked. On stage, the master of ceremonies adjusted the microphone. "And now," he said, "the recipient of this year's Global Real Estate Strategy Award." A large screen behind him lit up with a skyline projection. This award recognizes the strategist responsible for designing the $100 million redevelopment framework that stabilized the Midwest commercial portfolio during last year's market contraction. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Several people already knew the name. Then the CEO of the investment fund stepped onto the stage. Thomas Caldwell. His voice carried easily through the ballroom. "The strategy that protected that portfolio didn't come from a committee," he said. "It came from one person." He paused, scanning the audience. Isabella Mercer. For a moment the ballroom went still. Then chairs shifted, heads turned. Caldwell smiled slightly. "Some people close deals," he continued. Isabella builds the systems that keep those deals from collapsing." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Then applause began, and it didn't stop. People started standing, row by row. The front section rose to their feet. I walked toward the stage through a corridor of applause echoing against the marble walls. No one in this room called me a clerk. No one questioned whether I belonged here. Caldwell handed me the award plaque as cameras flashed. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Your work protected a lot of people's portfolios." "Thank you," I replied. A few minutes later, I returned to my table. The applause faded. The ballroom resumed its quiet conversations. My phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced down at the screen. Lila Grant's livestream was still running. My father and brother were still laughing at dinner. The applause from the ballroom was still echoing in my ears when the car door closed behind me. Outside, the night air along Michigan Avenue felt sharp and clean. My driver pulled away from the Grand Regency while the lights of downtown Chicago slid across the windows in long streaks of white and gold. For a few minutes, I just sat there. The award plaque rested on the seat beside me. Then I opened my laptop. The familiar login screen of the mortgage portal appeared, glowing softly in the dim light of the car. Username. Password. A few seconds later, the dashboard loaded. There it was. North Shore Residential Mortgage Monthly Payment. $32,418.77. Scheduled payment date tonight, 11:59 p.m. For 3 years, that number had left my account every single month. $32,000, 12 times a year. 3 years of quiet transfers that had kept my father's legacy house safely away from the bank's foreclosure department. The car turned onto Lakeshore Drive while I stared at the payment schedule. 3 years. 3 years of stabilizing a house filled with people who still thought my job was a joke. My phone vibrated. Lila Grant's livestream notification. I opened it for a moment. My father laughing. Daniel raising a glass. Lila smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Celebrating real success tonight." I closed the stream. Back on the mortgage portal. A small option sat just beneath the payment schedule. Automatic payment enabled. For a moment I studied it. $32,000 a month. A house that existed because someone quietly made sure the numbers never failed. I moved the cursor. Clicked. A confirmation window appeared. Disable automatic payments. I wasn't angry. Anger would have meant the moment mattered emotionally. This felt simpler than that. More like correcting a long-standing accounting error. I selected Confirm. The page refreshed. Automatic payment disabled. I closed the laptop and leaned back into the seat. Outside, Chicago kept moving as if nothing had changed, but somewhere on the quiet edge of North Shore, a $5 million house had just lost the person quietly holding it up, and a simple thought crossed my mind. If my family wanted a life without me tonight, they could start paying for it tomorrow. 2 days after the gala, the email arrived. Victor Mercer opened it while sitting in the study of the North Shore house, the same room where he used to take calls from investors and talk about deals that no longer existed. The subject line looked routine. Mortgage payment notice. He barely glanced at it at first. Then his expression changed. The message was short. Payment overdue. Immediate attention required. Victor frowned and reached for his phone. Probably a system error. He muttered. A few minutes later, he was connected to the bank. "Mercer Residence, North Shore Property," he said briskly. "There appears to be a mistake with the payment notice I just received." There was a pause while the representative checked the account. "Sir," the woman said carefully, "the automatic payment attached to that mortgage was disabled 2 days ago." Victor straightened in his chair. "That's impossible," he said sharply. "That payment has been scheduled for years." Another pause. Then the representative continued. "According to our records, the guarantor on the mortgage withdrew the authorization." Victor's brow tightened. Which guarantor? The answer came a moment later. The guarantor listed on the property is Isabella Mercer. The room went completely quiet. Victor didn't respond. Across the house, Daniel's voice echoed faintly from the living room television. A sports broadcast. Normal life continuing. Victor slowly lowered the phone from his ear and stared out the window at the manicured lawn stretching toward the lake. For 3 years, he had assumed the mysterious investor protecting the house was a private partner, someone who believed in the Mercer name, someone who understood its value. Now, the name on the mortgage agreement sat in front of him like a legal verdict. Isabella Mercer, his daughter. Victor didn't move for several seconds. And in that silence, something uncomfortable settled into place. For the first time since moving into the North Shore mansion, he understood something he had never bothered to ask before. The house he called his legacy had been standing all this time because someone else had been paying for it. Victor didn't end the call with the bank right away. "Send me the full loan file," he said. 10 minutes later, the documents arrived in his inbox. A complete mortgage agreement. Victor opened the PDF and began scrolling. Loan value, payment schedule, default clauses. Everything looked familiar until his eyes stopped at a single line halfway down the page. Guarantor, Isabella Mercer. He read it again, slower this time. Across the room, Daniel wandered into the study holding a drink. "What's going on?" he asked. Victor didn't answer immediately. He simply turned the laptop toward him. Daniel leaned forward and read the screen. His expression tightened. "What does that mean?" Victor's voice sounded lower now. "It means the bank didn't trust my company to hold the mortgage." Daniel frowned. So they needed someone else. Victor nodded once. Daniel kept reading. Then his expression changed. "Wait," he said slowly. "If she's the guarantor, that means the payments came from her." Victor didn't answer. The realization settled into the room like a slow pressure. 3 years, $32,000 every month. Daniel let out a quiet laugh of disbelief. 3 years, he muttered. "She's been paying for this house for 3 years. Victor closed the laptop halfway, but his mind had already drifted somewhere else. A memory surfaced. 3 years earlier, standing in this same study after the bank's first foreclosure warning, Isabella had walked in quietly and looked around the room. The walls, the view of the lake, the house that had suddenly become a problem. Then she said something that sounded almost casual. "The house is safe now." Victor had barely looked up from his paperwork. At the time, he thought it was reassurance, a daughter trying to comfort her father. Now the words sounded different. Not comfort, fact. Victor stared across the study. The leather chairs, the marble fireplace, the view he had proudly shown guests for years. And for the first time, a thought appeared that made the room feel strangely unfamiliar. This house hadn't been standing on his success. It had been standing on Isabella. Victor grabbed his phone. For the first time in years, the number he dialed belonged to someone he suddenly needed, Isabella Mercer. My phone rang while I was reviewing property reports in my office. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in days. Victor Mercer. For a moment, I let it ring. Not out of spite, just long enough to change the rhythm of the conversation. Then I answered. "Hello?" My father's voice came through immediately, tight with urgency. "Isabella." "What did you do?" I leaned back in my chair, glancing out at the skyline beyond the glass wall of my office. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "The mortgage," Victor snapped. The payment stopped. There was movement on the other end of the line, as if Daniel had stepped closer to the phone. "Just restart it," my brother added quickly. "It's probably some kind of banking error." I remained silent for a moment. Then I asked calmly, "Did you enjoy dinner?" The line went quiet. Victor cleared his throat. "That's not the point." "Oh," I said. From where I was sitting, it seemed very relevant. I turned slightly in my chair. I thought dinner with Daniel mattered more. Daniel's voice returned, defensive. This isn't the same thing. Victor cut him off. We could lose the house, he said, the strain finally breaking through his voice. For the first time during the call, he sounded less like the man who had laughed in the group chat, and more like someone who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he believed. I spoke quietly. You called my award meaningless. That's not what I meant. Clerks need their little trophies, I reminded him. Silence followed. A heavy silence. Then Victor exhaled slowly. We didn't know you were paying the mortgage. I didn't answer that, because the truth was simpler than that. They knew someone had been paying. They just never cared enough to ask who. Another silence filled the line. Then my father spoke again, but his voice sounded different now, less certain, less confident. Why didn't you tell us I looked out across the city, at the skyline I had spent years quietly building my career around? You never asked, I said. And on the other end of the call, the silence that followed was the sound of something shifting. For the first time in years, the balance of power in our family had quietly changed. The bank didn't wait long. 3 days after the payment failed, another notice arrived in my father's inbox. This one didn't look like a routine reminder. Mortgage default warning. If the missed payment wasn't resolved within the grace period, the file would move to foreclosure review. The language was polite. The meaning wasn't. Victor called again that afternoon. This time there was no accusation in his voice, only urgency. Isabella, he said carefully. The bank sent a foreclosure notice. I didn't answer immediately. They're saying the mortgage has to be reinstated immediately. He continued. Otherwise, they begin the foreclosure process. Daniel's voice appeared in the background. We're family, he said, stepping closer to the phone. You're really going to let the bank take the house? I looked out across the city from my office window. Traffic moved below like quiet streams of light. For a moment, I pictured the North Shore house exactly as it was. The polished kitchen counters, the lakefront terrace, the dining room where my father had toasted Daniel's success more times than I could count. Victor spoke again, quieter now. You know how much that house means to this family. I answered calmly. Family usually shows up when it matters. Silence. Longer this time. Daniel spoke again, less confident now. So, what are you saying? I rested my hand lightly on my desk. The answer felt surprisingly simple. I'm saying something very reasonable. Outside the glass wall of my office, the Chicago skyline reflected in the afternoon sun. Then I finished the sentence they had been waiting for. I'm not paying for a house. I paused just long enough for them to hear the finality in my voice, where I was never welcome. The line went completely quiet, and for the first time since the bank called them, my father understood that the house he had been fighting to keep had never actually been his to rely on. 3 months passed. The North Shore house was still standing, but it no longer looked like the monument my father used to boast about. Victor Mercer had been forced to sell several smaller properties and liquidate investments just to keep the mortgage current. The house survived, but the illusion that had built it didn't. Daniel's life changed too. Without the quiet safety net of my payments stabilizing the family finances, reality arrived quickly. The influencer dinners became less frequent. The late mornings disappeared. Eventually, the live streams stopped altogether. Bills have a way of reorganizing people's priorities. As for me, I moved. Not far. Just closer to the life I had already built. My new penthouse overlooked the same Chicago skyline I had spent years studying from conference rooms and board tables. From here, the city looked calm, ordered, logical. One evening, while organizing files on my laptop, I opened the old Mercer family group chat one last time. The screen filled with years of messages, dismissive jokes, laughing emojis, small reminders of a role I had quietly outgrown. For a moment, I simply looked at it. I didn't feel anger. Anger would have meant the past still had weight. Instead, I tapped delete. The conversation disappeared. No announcement, no dramatic goodbye, just the quiet closing of something that had already ended. And strangely enough, the feeling that followed wasn't triumph. It was relief. Because freedom doesn't always come from winning. Sometimes it comes from finally stepping away from responsibilities that were never truly yours. People often assume the quiet person in the room has the least power, but sometimes the quiet person is the one quietly holding everything together. And when that person finally steps away, everything built on their silence has to stand on its own. So, if you've ever been the person quietly carrying more than anyone realized, I'd honestly like to hear where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments, because stories like this tend to reveal the same truth. Sometimes the most expensive lesson people ever learn is discovering who was quietly paying for their life all along.